Today is Tuesday, September 25th, 2012. We are here to interview Dr. David M. McCoy, who served in the United States Army. I am Philip Lee, friend of Dr. McCoy. Also present are my wife, Esther Lee, Dr. McCoy's wife, Julie, and their son, Forrest. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. We are in College Grove, Tennessee. Hello, Dr. McCoy.
Hey, good to be here.
Thank you for coming out for this interview. And if you would just start off by telling us a little bit about where you grew up, why you decided to go into the military, and take it from there.
Oh, sure enough. I was born November 1st, 1958 in Oak Ridge in East Tennessee. And it was fascinating growing up in Oak Ridge because at the time it was still a government town. And in fact, the hospital that I was born in there in Oak Ridge was still an Army hospital, that the Army was staffing and running the hospital there in Oak Ridge as it was in the process of being opened up further and further to regular activities after the Cold War project, which followed after the atomic bomb project, Manhattan project that involved Oak Ridge, and at that time it was Clinton Engineering Works. Growing up there in Oak Ridge, it was among a lot of the veterans, World War II veterans. My father had been a Navy corpsman in World War II in a hospital ship, and he'd spent 3 years in the South Pacific. Our next door neighbor was Frank Finch, was a combat engineer, had been in Europe during World War II, and then had been in Korea during the Korean War. The neighbor right straight across the street was a World War I veteran, and that was Bill Hopkins. And then the other side of us, our neighbor on the left, Booty Hunt, was in an engineer company operating railroad operations on the Western Front during World War II also. So surrounded by veterans, grew up in a military town that was transitioning, but still a very remarkable historic context. I grew up in a very patriotic setting, and it was all about national interests, the Oak Ridge mission changing from the atomic bomb through the Cold War, really producing so many of the warhead components for the nuclear missiles during the Cold War. And it was interesting, we really didn't have nearly as much of the interest or focus on all the preparations for surviving the Cold War. It was kind of assumed that Oak Ridge was not going to exist for very long if we got into open conflict with the Soviet Union, that it would all be destroyed immediately anyway. And so we didn't have nearly so much of that fallout shelter preparation. A lot of families in Oak Ridge did have fallout shelters, but it was kind of the false hope. It's like, this is not going to make any difference in the world. So my father never would let us have a fallout shelter, and he wasn't that excited about the evacuation plans because he figured that if the Soviets did hit Oak Ridge, they'd miss it just barely and hit wherever we were up on the plateau anyway. So he wasn't excited about it. I was not at all in a fearful, apprehensive background growing up, and everybody in my family had served. My grandfathers had been in World War I. I grew up with a World War I hero, Don Grove, that lived there close to us in Loudon. It was very much a familiar family experience. And then when I went away to get ready to go to college, it was interesting. To start with, I thought, well, and especially Frank Finch, the Army veteran next door, he kept saying, get an appointment, we'll get an appointment for you to go to West Point. And I just decided, no, I didn't think that was the thing for me to do. I didn't feel like God was calling me to that. So I thought, well, I'll look at VMI, and VMI was just West Point and having to pay for it yourself and being on scholarship, if that, in Virginia. So I finally decided, no, I'm real interested in Civil War history. I'd grown up with that, hunting Civil War relics since I was 9 years old with a metal detector, going with my uncle, the Korean War veteran, and we were all excited about it growing up. I decided I wanted to go where there was a big interest in Civil War history. I'd go to UVA and see if I could enroll a kind in Virginia. And that worked out great. So I had an engineering background from a very technical high school background growing up in Oak Ridge. I was in chemical engineering as an undergraduate at UVA from 76 to 1980, and it was again part of the patriotic influence, graduating from high school in 1976. Right on to college, got out of college in chemical engineering and thought, well, I would need something, what's the hardest thing I could possibly do? I'd go to medical school. And then the decision was stay in Virginia. I'd gotten to relic hunt some, gotten to meet some people and get plugged into that historic context too. And then thought, no, it's time for me to come back home. And that, of course, was real important, coming back to go to medical school at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And so while I was here, I met my wife sharing a hymnal at Woodmont Baptist Church there in Nashville. And it was very much in obedience to the Lord. I was finally willing to join the church. I'd been through a big church fight in Oak Ridge, and I thought, I'm just not going to move my letter. And then finally I felt, no, as I'd prayed and struggled with it, God was leading me to go ahead and join the church there at Woodmont Baptist Church in Nashville. And moved up to the front of the church, sharing a pew, coincidentally with the pew her family was on. But I was on the end. Older couple came in and said, well, but you're in our seat on the pew. And,
I know that feeling.
I explained to them, no, I'm going to join the church today, so I need to sit on the end. And they just looked real puzzled and said, but you're in our seat. So I moved to the middle of the pew and was sitting right next to my wife-to-be. So God took care of me, and that comes up again in my story. It comes up over and over, but again, especially in my military history. I was initially, my first year of medical school, not on scholarship. At that time, they had what was called a health profession scholarship program that the military, in my case the Army, would send me to medical school, and I would owe them year for year when I got out after my internship and residency. Or if the Army saw fit, I would have to go after my internship and serve my active duty payback for my scholarship for medical school. Well, I was tapped out, and there was no way to pay for medical school after college. Paying for that, I paid for the first year, and it broke the bank. So it's like, okay, time for me to break down and get the scholarship. And I felt like I was leaving my options open as much as I could. There was a minimum of a 3-year service period to get the 3-year payback, the obligation. That comes up to be important again too later. What was fascinating then, got on the program, finished medical school, and at that time I had the best of absolutely every experience. If there was a gold brick in Army service, that was me. Never had anything awkward, uncomfortable, dangerous that I didn't choose to do. And the amazing thing, it was during the height of the Cold War. The big thinking was we're going to fight the Russians in Western Europe. All the preparation was for Western Europe because the Korean Peninsula was a complete standoff after the Korean War. We didn't have any idea we'd have to serve in the Pacific or the East Asia. It would all go to Europe. And my preparation, medical officer's basic, I did at Monterey, California, at Fort Ord. Beautiful place, loved California. All we worried about the whole time I was at Fort Ord was what are we going to do this evening and what are we going to do this weekend. Because medical officer's basic, unlike so much of the rest of the basic training, about half the class sat there and read the newspaper while they were doing the different classes and presentations. And it was things like nuclear, biological, chemical warfare preparation, and we figured that's not going to matter. If that happens, we're all going to die anyway. So there was a certain cynicism about all of it, that what mattered we'll learn later, what didn't matter we don't need to bother with now anyway. But they coddled us along. We got carried through our basic training, learning to salute and all that sort of thing in Fort Ord. And right there in Monterey Peninsula, it was beautiful. After that, got through the rest of my medical school experience, and like I said, my last year of medical school, met my wife. And we were busy at the time thinking, well, should we do internship and residency? I knew I wanted to be in family practice. The military was real strong in primary care. Vanderbilt was not and still isn't. real strong on doctors going into primary care medicine. They looked at it as a subspecialty preparation. But there were 10 of us the year I graduated from Vanderbilt in 1984 that went into family practice. I was one of them. I was in the Army, and the great thing, I didn't have to worry about match day getting my residency because I'd already had my residency in hand. I had done a rotation, 6-week clinical rotation at Fort Belvoir in Northern Virginia. And pulling some strings, begging and pleading, it worked out great. They picked me in their match. I already had my internship lined up. Now, the way the military worked, residency was not a given, but as long as you did a good job and weren't the class screw up, typically you'll do your residency right after internship and stay right where you are. Mm-hmm. And so I did, right there at Fort Belvoir. Had some fascinating experiences while we were there. I got, and again, this is me plotting and planning all the details of my life and then God working it out according to His will. I ended up graduating from med school on one day in May of 1984 and got married the very next day. And it was crazy. We thought it'd be easier, big mistake. 2 big things right together was a mess. God made it all turn out fine though. And we went through internship and residency there at Fort Belvoir, met some amazing people, general officers, people with amazing historic backgrounds because of the DC area. Lots of the general officers like to retire in that vicinity and have access to Walter Reed, the Navy Hospital at Bethesda. We met some neat folks and dinner plans with World War I, World War II veterans, Marines, sailors, Army, all right there in that area. Got to visit the White House while I was in my residency. And that was fascinating because one of the guys I'd done a vasectomy on was in the White House detail. The Department of Defense had lots of their personnel that would be detailed to Secret Service or to CIA, FBI, other agencies, and on special assignment. And these were Army soldiers detailed to Secret Service to maintain White House security, their motor pool, their vehicles back and forth. And sure enough, I did the vasectomy on this guy, and we got to be friends. We had dinner together, and he said, hey, you want to come to the White House? So Julie and I got to go to the Oval Office, and Reagan was out of town. They picked a weekend that he was, picked us up on a Sunday morning in one of the limousines, White House limousines. Had to go to the White House garage, change cars to one that had been scrubbed, that was free of any bugs or potential devices, and then went to the White House in that vehicle and got to be in the Oval Office. And that was fascinating, just immaculate. It was completely cleaned and scrubbed, waiting for the president to come back, and we get to put our heads in there and look. So we had a good time. The neat things like that. One of the things, though, that was a special event, while I was in my internship there at Fort Belvoir, this fella called me one time that was with the, he was a psychiatrist, and said, hey, I'm a Vanderbilt alumnus, I know you're up here in the area, we'd love to get together and just visit with you while you're here, maybe it would be good for you to come out. And that's all it was, a Vanderbilt alumnus who was a psychiatrist. And I kept putting him off. I mean, we had so few weekends free, but he kept persisting. He'd wait 4 or 5 weeks and call me again. Wait 4 or 5 weeks and call me again. So I finally agreed. We went, and he had a beautiful home in Northwest Washington, D.C. that was in the embassy section. Beautiful place. And I thought, man, this guy's done well. And so just in conversation back and forth, so where do you work? And turned out he worked for the CIA at Langley in Northern Virginia. And he said, you know, while we were there, had dinner, had a great time, interacted, they got to visit. And he said, you know, this is wonderful, this is great. Sometime maybe you ought to come out and have lunch with me at my office. And I said, well, that would be fine. And you think, I'm not going to ever do that. I'll never hear from him again. And he, same thing, kept calling. And finally, okay, I'll go and have lunch with you at your office. And that's how it was supposed to be. And next thing you know, I go out there, and it was amazing. I was wearing an open collar Class B uniform, just the trousers, the open collar, and I'm thinking to just meet this fellow that I've met before, and we're going to have lunch and we'll visit, and then it'll take a couple hours and be done. What happened was I ended up in the executive dining room at Langley in the CIA headquarters, and I'm having lunch with the vice chief of all of CIA, and everybody's coat and tie. I mean, this is an executive dining room, very appropriate, and they're just all being nice to me and wanting to talk to me. And then I have another interview after that. After I was there till it got dark. It was so all afternoon I was interview after interview, and they were actually recruiting me to come into the CIA. And it was the most peculiar thing, because at the time I told him, I said, well, you know, I'm in the Army, I have this obligation, I have to pay back my scholarship. And this, I thought the guy never would stop laughing. He started laughing, he was laughing so hard. And it's like, by the time you get back to Fort Belvoir, you won't be in the Army anymore. You'll be in the CIA. We'll let you finish your internship and residency. You'll go through that process while you're there, but you won't actually belong to them, you'll belong to us, and we'll pick up your obligation on the backside after you're in the CIA. And so I thought, well, man, this is cool. This is just the thing I should do. And so I came back home that evening all wide-eyed and told Julie all about my interviews with the CIA, my adventures, and she didn't want any part of that. So it was fascinating. Her feeling was, no, you'll be gone all the time. And they were very direct. They said you'd be on the road about a third of the time. You'd be in a safe house setting about 2/3 of the time. You would have several levels of cover. You might work as a physician for Domino Sugar and be stationed in Panama, but in your next level of cover, it's like finally, okay, well, I work for State Department. But they said nobody's never know that you work for the CIA. That's something that never should come out. And what we want you to do is take care of friendlies and potential friendlies, and want you to just especially take care of military professionals and their families all over the world. And that's why we want you as a family physician. That piece of the story comes back later too. So anyhow, Julie said, no, you're married now, and I'm not going to be married to that and have you running all over the world. Internship and residency is hard enough. And that was the big thing too with the CIA. You needed to be worldwide deployable. And you go anywhere in the world, we're not going to recruit you in just to go to Europe or just to go to Asia. You have to go anywhere, anytime. And that was just like the Army was doing at the time, so that didn't bother me. But I still had to tell them no, I couldn't play with them anymore. And they left me alone, and they never bothered me again, never heard another word. But it was fascinating. When I told them about my background and growing up in Oak Ridge, they knew everything. They knew my friends, my family, my neighbors. They knew anybody I'd ever talked to by the time I was visiting. Before the questions were asked, they knew all the answers. It was funny that in the interviews, the big things were that you could never, ever have had any illicit drug use. And they kept asking me 2 or 3 different times, 2 or 3 different ways, have you ever used drugs, ever do it? It's like, no, I've never used drugs. And they said, well, there's going to be a lie detector test, and we're going to ask you with the lie detector. I said, that's fine, you can ask me the way you want to ask me. I have never done it, it's not an issue. So it must have been an issue for them at the time, the personnel they were getting in, that they needed folks that they could count on that weren't involved in that exploding worldwide drug trafficking situation. It was fascinating too that I asked them, well, how much do y'all pay? And they said, well, it would start off $70,000 a year, all in gold and all deposited anywhere you wanted it deposited in the world. And I thought, and they said, no, that was on top, that's your base salary plus whatever you want to do on the side. So anything you do on the side, projects wise, that's in addition to that. I thought, this is sounding really remarkable. So for a youngster growing up in Oak Ridge, kind of a semi-rural background on my parents' side really, this was the big time. I thought this is, my wife said no. Well, come to find out, so I never did that. Ended up finishing internship and residency. We thought we were going to Western Europe, thought we were going to Heidelberg actually in Germany, but I ended up in a Bible study one morning with the guy coming down to make the assignments, And he just asked me point blank where I want to go, and I told him I looked to go to Western Europe, and he said, well, how would you like to go to West Point and go to the military academy and be on staff up there? And I thought, well, that's amazing. I would be thrilled after thinking about going to West Point and being a cadet to suddenly go and be on staff. That might be an amazing opportunity. As I said, yeah, I'd like that just fine. I'd like to go to West Point. So in the Bible study, he's like, well, we'll see what we can do. And then sure enough, here come the assignments out. And I had a wonderful, wonderful friend that was just fantastic, Tom Howard, that I'd gone through all my rotations with at Fort Belvoir. And Tom was just a genius. Tom was the professional soldier. Tom was the West Point grad. And Tom got sent to Europe. I got to go to West Point. And you know, he was real mad about it, but he accepted it. He was real good about it, that instead of him going back to West Point, it was me. And at the time, no way that should have fit. But I got to go to West Point. I was on staff for 3 years. We got to see so many things. Again, meeting so many people. A lot of general officers were retired in and around West Point, and we got to meet some great folks. After that, we thought, well, this is it. This will be payback. I'll go somewhere terrible. And as it was, coming down, I had the opportunity to get on out of the Army, and we couldn't wait, because we were going to get out of the Army. I was going to come back here, and before something terrible happened. So I had no intention to stay in one day past my obligation. Because I had been on scholarship at Vanderbilt for 3 years instead of 4, all of the other guys I was through internship residency with were 4-year scholarship people. Every one of them went somewhere, either Korea, Western Europe, and then what happened, 6 weeks, July of 1990, I got out of the Army from West Point and got discharged. 6 weeks later, Desert Shield, Desert Storm started up. And because I was already out of the Army, we thought, well, this is it. This is payback. I'll get sent to the nastiest place in the world and go to the Middle East and get ready to fight Saddam and all of that mess. And the big concern that we had was the nuclear, biological, and chemical. I thought, this is it. I'm going to get paid back for all that stuff I slept through in medical officers basic. All that stuff I blew off in Oak Ridge growing up. All of those things I never was afraid of. Time to get afraid all at once. And we thought we were going to get called back any moment. And they'd send out periodically reminders, checking on addresses, checking on phone numbers from the Army, because the Army immediately had put in the stop loss order. Anyone who was still in the Army, even if you were due to get out, you couldn't get out while the state of emergency was there with Desert Shield, Desert Storm. As it was, since I'd already gotten out, they never did call me back. And they were calling up. The Army played the trick, the card that they'd been waiting on all through the Cold War years. All of those health profession scholarship program guys, as we got out, the arrangement was that if you separated from the Army, you thought you were out. No one realized, they never told us, you had to resign your commissions to get out of your obligation. And if you didn't resign your commission, they automatically put you in what they called an inactive reserve or inactive ready reserve, such that they could call you back on a moment's notice. So there were medical officers that had been out 3, 4, 5 years, all kinds of specialties, orthopedics, neurosurgeons, any type of surgical subspecialty, but primary care as well. The plan was, is all through the Cold War, we got to take care of even the primary care docs. We'll use nurse practitioners and PAs in battalion clearing stations. And we thought, yeah, that's a joke. As soon as the expression went, as soon as war breaks out in Western Europe, they called it, when the balloon goes up, we'll all be in battalion clearance stations. But as it ended up, I wasn't even in there at all. All those guys that had thought that all those years at the Health Profession Scholarship Program, yeah, the balloon went up, and it's in Iraq and Kuwait, and suddenly they called all those guys up that thought they were out of the Army. And the hard part about it, they had spent 3, 4, 5, 6 years doing a practice, buying a house. Some of them married the second time, some of them owning the second house, and suddenly they activate everybody and say, you have orders to report. And they just get, that's the notice that you're back in the Army, you have orders to report. And a lot of them wasn't necessarily going to Kuwait or Iraq. They were going to Fort Gordon, they were going to Fort Stewart, they're going to Fort Belvoir. They're backfilling for active duty medical officers that are going to the theater to fight the war. And you've still lost everything because your practice is gone. Your buddies try to hold it together for a year, 2 years, 3 years, some of them. You're back in the military service and you can't pay for the house, the boat, the other wife, and you're broke. So it was an avalanche, kind of an unknown national catastrophe. How many medical officers went broke because of being activated and called up for service? As it was, the last letter I had from them was, you better get back in now. If you don't volunteer for overseas service or active duty service, we're going to call you. You're going to get orders any day now. That was January, February time frame of 1991. Within 2 to 4 weeks later, Desert Shield became Desert Storm. The war was over in 100 hours. We never did get called up. So I was in an inactive reserve status all through that. Ended up, I was in the Army total of 6 years active, counting internship and residency. I was in 5 more reserve, most of it was inactive reserve. And I thought, well, that's that. I'll never fool with this again. I'm finally done with it. As soon as they would accept our resignations, every medical officer in every branch, I think, Army, Air Force, everybody got out after Desert Shield, Desert Storm. The problem was, then we started fighting again in Iraq and later now in Afghanistan, and it's been a real problem getting medical officers. Because the military could play that card once, call up everybody that was still in that didn't know they were in. But boy, now everybody that's out knows they're out, and that'll never happen again. So it's harder to get military medical officers. 2 last pieces of the story which were just fascinating for me. I got out, I thought, that's it, I'll never face that issue again. And just in 1990, with all the chaos and turmoil in primary care medicine, I'd been in private practice 23 years. God really did lay it on my heart, you know, you need to get out of this. And so we said, yes, Lord, we've been praying about it. We believe you. We honor you. We will trust you. You show us where to go, and we'll get out of private practice. And God said, no, no, no. You quit first, and then I'll show you where to go. And so we did it, and Julie pushed the button, sent the fax. I got out of private practice. We resigned, and we'd been looking at the VA, thinking about the VA. I had such an interest in military history, and I thought, well, this is a golden opportunity. To get back in, we found on January the 1st, 2010, we got out of private practice and accepted a position in Knoxville Outpatient Clinic. I had to commute back and forth for 6 months. No idea, though. And that's the classic story. After the fact, you know how long it's going to take. Before the fact, you never know. This was us. We didn't know where we were going to go. We got the position with the VA. Didn't know how long we were going to be there. We took the plunge. God led us finally from that wilderness experience. I got brought back in Nashville to the post-deployment clinic at the VA. And that was fascinating. The guy I was working with, I talked to, I'd known in 1990 when I first got out of the Army. And Gordon Aiken said, if you'll get over there and take that position in Knoxville, soon I'll get you this job. And I thought, Gordon, I've been in the Army, I've been all this time now, private practice, I'm back in the VA, nothing works like it's supposed to. That will never happen. And 6 months later, Gordon said, that's it, I'm going to Arkansas. Why don't you come take this job here? Just transfer over here. It'll take you 2 or 3 weeks. Gordon, it took months to get the VA stuff processed. There's no way that's going to happen. Sure enough, they did it. I thought they'd never do it just because we said that we wanted them to, but they did it. Gordon moved to Arkansas. I moved back over to Nashville, and just like that, I was the post-deployment doctor at the Nashville VA Medical Center. And it had gone full circle from medical school at Vanderbilt to internship residency at Fort Belvoir to active duty time at West Point in New York. Suddenly full circle, I'm back in Nashville. I'm right on the other side of the window of the walk from the parking lot to the medical center at Vanderbilt, where I started off in 1984. Oh, pardon me, 1980 at the time. The other neat thing, just recently, working out in the gym, got to know real well an Air Force general officer. And this general officer is in an Air Force Reserve Medical Unit. He spent time because he's apparently got a position of great deal of responsibility in Afghanistan. And I'm working out next to him, and he's working out, there's another physician right beside him that I had known for years when I was in private practice. And they're holding a conversation with me right there beside him. I just happened to overhear this general officer that's in the Air Force talking to the other doctor and saying how bad he felt for all those family physicians that he had seen who were working with intelligence operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan that were in the middle of the interrogation procedures, the waterboarding that took place, and they were in a position of trying to keep suspects, Al-Qaeda friendlies, potential friendlies, that in the process of the intelligence gathering, those medical officers were in a position of having to keep those folks alive long enough to get the information out of them. So the point was close enough to dying that they would tell you the information you wanted and tell you the truth and tell you right now, but also keeping them alive long enough to get the information. Mm-hmm. So I listened to that and I thought, once again, truly, truly God delivered me from saying yes to the CIA, and I would have been in the position of developing the procedures that were later implemented for that kind of intelligence gathering. So just as well I don't have that on my conscience. So truly now I work with people that have dealt with so many things. I've led a golden life through military service, back to the VA. I feel especially blessed, delivered, protected, and still fascinated by military history. I'm excited about helping to preserve military history. Thanks.
Okay, Doc, didn't you say that there was another story that you'd like to tell us about?
Oh, yes. There was a couple of incidents that occurred while I was on my active duty time. One incident was while I was at Medical Officers Basic and still in medical school at the time. I was at Monterey, Fort Ord, California, and it was a training experience where we had enlisted soldiers trying to help us experience what the full-blown military training was like. We never had it. Our field training experience, we had 3 days of one military training exercise at one point, and we had a day or two of the training otherwise, but never weeks at a time like the real folks had. One of the episodes, though, during the training was a fellow trying to teach us how to use the light anti-tank weapon, and the idea was that every man on the European front, if the Russians invaded, would have these anti-tank weapons, and every man would be potentially a tank destroyer. And I thought, well, this is good. I'll learn all about this law. You never know, I might need to use the law. And it was a rocket tube about 3 feet long, very simple looking device. And this sergeant was going to show us how to use the law. And we were getting ready for all this technical discussion, technical presentation, very precise order of doing things. And the way he got up in front of us, he said, well, this here is the law. Let me show you how to use this. You take it and you put this end here up on your shoulder, and you take this other end and you point it downrange. You look through this little sight right here, and you push this button here till things line up. And when it lines up on that sight, then you go ahead and push this thing here down. And when you push that down, it'll allow you to push this thing in over here. That'll arm the weapon, and be real careful because it's about to go off. So hold it still on your shoulder when you've got this lined up on the target. And at that point, all of us knew we were in so much trouble it didn't matter if we knew how to use the law or not. Because it would be people like that who did or didn't use it appropriately that we had to count on. So once again, it was a leap of faith, staying in, finishing the active duty obligation. Another incident occurred while I was actually in my internship and residency at Fort Belvoir. And Belvoir was in an interesting situation because we were a community care hospital just south of Alexandria, and Walter Reed, our big medical center, which we called Wally World. Wally World was on the other side of DC. Anything we had, major trauma, complicated OBGYN cases, complicated surgical cases, we would move them to Walter Reed for those procedures to be done. And that was fine if it was elective issues, but especially OB. OB could be normal, panic, move them to Walter Reed. One of the things that I remembered was being tasked, and as an intern, typically the low man on the totem pole got to fly on the helicopter through whatever the weather conditions were with a woman who might be 26, 28 weeks in labor, premature delivery, imminent. Somebody had to go with her in case she delivered on the way. And if it was an emergency like that, they'd move them by helicopter. So I was in the Huey helicopters, just like they were in Vietnam, that they would land there at Belvoir, take us off the ambulance with the patient, and I was the medical officer then assigned to fly with the patient. It's like we're going to be able to do anything in a helicopter if she delivers on the way anyway. What we might be able to do is catch the baby and keep it out of the floor, and that'd be the end of it. But the goal was we'd stay with them in case anything went wrong and flying across. Well, at that time, of course, it was before 9/11 and all the mess that restricted flying in the airspace over DC and really most any other city in America. And we flew low as fast as that helicopter could go from Fort Belvoir low right across DC. And it was not just over the monuments, it was among the monuments, going right past the Capitol, right past the Washington Monument. And of course, these are Army helicopter pilots. They're completely authorized to do whatever it takes to get the patient from Belvoir to Walter Reed as fast as possible. And they're taking advantage of their opportunity to fly among the monuments, and I'm along for the ride. And that was great to get to see all this stuff lit up at night. It's like, oh boy, we get to fly right through it. And I remember that. Another memorable incident, though, was being on a slower transport of a similar emergency OB situation, a woman in premature labor, and they were moving her by ambulance then from Fort Belvoir, from its DeWitt Army Community Hospital over to Walter Reed. And at this point, this woman was in premature labor with twins. And so the Army, in its wisdom, decided they needed to have 2 medical officers so there'd be one to hold each baby if it come flying out in the ambulance on the way to Walter Reed. And so I was a resident who went with an intern who rode with the woman in the back. And it was typical. This happened every month or two. We'd have to do one of these transports to Walter Reed. So I was on call as the resident riding with this other intern. And the woman, of course, she's lying on the stretcher in the middle of the ambulance. The trip to Walter Reed completely uneventful. We get her off, we get her out, she's through the emergency room, she's up to OB. Our job is done, everybody back in the ambulance. It's about 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the morning, time to go back to Belvoir. Another night's sleep shot. So the other guy, all he wanted to do is talk, the intern. So he sat on the bench in the back of the ambulance jabbering. And so I said, you can jabber all you want, I'm going to lie her down. Right here in the stretcher we just got her out of, I'm going to lie down in the stretcher, I can sleep on the way back. So I'm lying down and he's going on and I'm asleep. And so suddenly the intern that's going on and on says, they smell smoke up in the front of the ambulance. And I thought, yeah, Ron, that's great. And then finally, they think they smell fire in the front of the ambulance. Yeah, Ron, I don't think there's fire in the ambulance. I think you're making it up. I'm not sure, I'm not dreaming this anyway. So it's and I'm asleep. And finally, the ambulance slams to a stop. And what they were trying to do is get back to Fort Belvoir because it was very important that there was far less paperwork to write up on the ambulance if it caught fire on government property than if it caught fire on public property between Walter Reed and Fort Belvoir. So rather than stop and get out of the ambulance, their plan was, let's see if we couldn't get back to Fort Belvoir before it caught fire. They get right to the gate at Fort Belvoir. The ambulance now is filling with smoke. Ron's pitching a fit. I'm finally waking up. Ron jumps out of the ambulance. No, Ron says, it's on fire, it's on fire, it's on fire. Get up, David, you got to get out of the ambulance. I wake up, realize the ambulance is on fire. Ron's fiddling around with they have a special OB emergency delivery kit that's got all this gear and equipment you'd never be able to use anyway. But it's all there in case you ever thought you needed to. And Ron's gathering up the equipment. I jump out of the ambulance and close the door behind me. So Ron has got his arms full of all the equipment now back in the ambulance. The driver and co-driver in the front of the ambulance, they're long gone. And all I hear when I'm finally waking up, standing outside the ambulance and watching it catch fire, is Ron on the inside of the ambulance knocking on the door. David, please open the door. David, open the door. And I thought, so I opened the door. Ron, what are you still doing in the ambulance? Get out of the ambulance, it's on fire. So Ron jumps out of the ambulance and we wait. It ended up that they failed to tell the military police that we're trying to get back on Belvoir. So now we're outside the locked gate at the lower entrance at Fort Belvoir. Can't get the burning ambulance back inside the gate. The MPs finally get there, get the gate unlocked, and everybody's gathered around the ambulance that's really starting to catch fire. They call the fire department comes, and then it finally dawns on me, wait a minute. This might not be the best place to be because the ambulance is a very advanced, expensive ambulance. It's got oxygen tanks on board, and now it's all burning. It's like, so it finally dawns on me, the engineering background kicks back in, and I tell Ron, I think we need to get away from the ambulance. The MPs now have gotten there and opened it, and they're still letting it burn up on the outside of the gate. And Ron, I think we need to get away from the ambulance. The oxygen's going to blow up here in a minute. And the MPs are all gathered around, the fire department's all gathered around. The decision was made, instead of trying to put the fire out, they're just going to finally, it's a waste anyway, just let it burn itself out. I finally decide I can't get anybody to get away from the ambulance. I said, well, I'm going up here to the top of this hill, and I'll watch it blow up from up there, and you all can stay down here. And so about the time I got to the top of the hill, the top of the ambulance blew off, the oxygen tank shot up into the air over Fort Belvoir. And Ron finally, by this time, has run and caught up to the top of the hill. The MPs are at the top of the hill, the fire department's to the four winds, and the ambulance does finally sit there and burn up. But classic Army fashion, now the next issue is, who's responsible for the ambulance that burned up? So they start, every officer has to start writing out an account of what you saw when the ambulance caught fire on the way back from Walter Reed, from Wally World to Fort Belvoir. Where were you when the ambulance burned up? So I sat down right after morning report back at the hospital, because I had to go back and be on call after it burnt up, and write out in longhand what I saw. And the greatest thing in the world, though, was at morning report the next day, all these, the medical officers were there, and we had our commanding officer that was head of our family practice program at Fort Belvoir, great guy, Bill Minor, who had played linebacker for Woody Hayes. So you can imagine, Woody Hayes at Ohio State, in its heyday, Bill Minor played football in college, hulking monster of a man. And he's sitting right there in the front, and we'd written on the board, as per the usual, the patients that had been admitted and deliveries and things that we'd had to do. And one this, one that, one this, and one ambulance burned up. So I just wrote it on the board, the ambulance got burned up. So he's sitting there, we're going through making the and then Bill looks at it, and it finally hits him. And he's leaning forward, and he's looking at it, and he sees there, one ambulance burned up. And then he stops everything. Stop everything. What happened to the ambulance? And so I said, it burned up? And he said, I need to know more about this. We can hear the rest of this later. And so next thing you know, I'm in Bill Minor's office, and then I'm writing up my report, and then Ron's writing up his report about what happened when the ambulance burned up. And theoretically, we could, the good thing, even though I was the resident, he was the intern, I was a captain, Ron was a major, and in the finest tradition of the military, Ron was going to get blamed if there was blame to go around for the ambulance that got burned up anyway. But as it turned out, everything was fine. Nobody had to pay for the ambulance. But we went over it and looked at it later. It's this burnt out hulk on this parking lot at Fort Belvoir. And it's probably there to this day. The burnt out ambulance just there on the back side. It's like, we got to keep this. If anybody ever says whatever happened to the ambulance, you can go out and look. There's this burnt out hulk of what had been the Army ambulance.
Mm.
Those were mine. That's the closest I ever came to getting a Purple Heart while I was in the Army.
Thank you again. Thanks very much, Dr. McCoy.
Mm-hmm.